Hello there and welcome to the Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into feudal Japan, medieval Paris, candlelit Renaissance Italy, and the distant marble halls of Byzantium, letting old myths loosen their armor piece by piece until something more human quietly appears beneath them. Because the world you usually imagine when someone says feudal Japan is often very polished. You picture perfect samurai, standing in falling cherry blossoms, silent ninjas gliding across rooftops like shadows, wise sword masters speaking in riddles, and rulers who somehow manage entire kingdoms while looking impossibly calm. And to be fair, history did leave behind beauty. Silk robes did rustle softly through lantern-lit streets. Temple bells really did drift through the morning fog. Tea steam really did curl upward beside quiet gardens of stone and moss. But history, while it was actually happening, usually felt less like a painting and more like trying to carry water uphill in the rain. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum gently in the background, and let's slowly step into the past together. You begin in Japan, sometime during the long years when samurai still carried swords through crowded streets, though many of them spent more time worrying about paperwork than duels. Rain taps softly against wooden roof overhead. Somewhere, nearby, water drips steadily from a bamboo pipe into a stone basin, with a hollow clack every few moments, patient and repetitive enough to make you sleepy all by itself. The room smells faintly of damp straw mats, old smoke, and ink. A samurai kneels near a candle, shoulders slightly bent, not because he has returned from glorious battle, but because he has spent most of the evening calculating rice taxes. That part appears rarely in movies. Popular culture often treats samurai like perfectly disciplined warrior philosophers who floated through life, guided by unbreakable honor. But real samurai were human beings trapped inside political systems, family obligations, debt, weather, exhaustion, and occasionally very poor decisions. Some were brave, some were cruel, some were deeply loyal, others switched sides the moment survival demanded it. During the violent Sengoku period, the warring states era, alliances could shift so quickly that keeping track of enemies sometimes became harder than actually fighting them. A lord defeated in spring might return in autumn wearing different colors and calling himself your ally. There is something strangely modern about that. The famous code of Bushido, often imagined as an ancient and perfectly unified moral system, was actually shaped much later, especially during the peaceful Tokugawa years, after the worst wars had already ended. Historians like Oleg Benish have pointed out that many samurai ideals became more formalized once large-scale fighting faded away. In some ways, it was a little like writing strict gym rules after everyone had already gone home and taken a bath. Quietly amusing, perhaps. Although probably less amusing if you were the one paying for the gym. You step outside now into a narrow street where lantern light glows softly against wet wood. A pair of samurai pass nearby, sandals scraping faintly against damp earth. One smells faintly of horse sweat beneath expensive incense. The other looks tired enough to fall asleep standing upright. That, too, was part of samurai life. By the peaceful Edo period, many samurai had become administrators rather than battlefield warriors. They handled records, supervised taxes, participated in ceremonies, copied documents, and tried very hard not to embarrass their families publicly. Some became scholars, some taught swordsmanship, some quietly struggled with money because, despite their high status, many received fixed stipends, while merchants around them slowly grew richer. A surprising number of elite warriors were financially anxious men with elegant handwriting. In a nearby farming village, a man named Taro kneels beside hidden sacks of rice beneath loose floorboards. His hands are rough from years of work in wet fields. Outside, frogs murmur softly in flooded paddies beneath the darkening sky. Tax collectors are expected within days. Taro's wife says very little while sewing patchwork clothing near the doorway. But both of them know the same truth. If too much rice leaves the house, winter will become painfully long. If too little is declared, punishment may follow. and so survival settles into small calculations. Quiet ones, the kind ordinary people rarely write poems about. Meanwhile, somewhere far away inside a castle office lit by smoky candles, another samurai presses an ink brush against paper while trying not to make accounting mistakes that could anger his lord. The romantic image of samurai life usually focuses on swords. Yet for long stretches of Japanese history, administration mattered just as much as combat. Rice production, irrigation, roads, bridges, marriages, alliances, and political loyalty all require endless management. Even the sword itself was not always the center of warfare. Early samurai were famous mounted archers long before the katana became a modern cultural obsession. Battles were often loud, muddy, chaotic affairs, full of ashigaru foot soldiers carrying spears, exhausted horses, smoke, confusion, and fear. Not elegant duels beneath drifting petals, although petals did drift sometimes. History is kind rarely enough to choose only one mood at a time. You can hear distant thunder now rolling softly beyond the hills. Rain begins again, tapping against the city in uneven rhythms. Somewhere in the darkness, a temple bell sounds low and heavy through humid air. Inside another dim room, a samurai removes part of his armor with a slow sigh of relief. The lacquered plates creak softly as he sets them down beside him. Beneath all the silk cords and polished surfaces is simply another tired human body, sore from weight, weather, and expectation. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about history. The further away people become, the more perfect they often appear. Their rough edges soften, their boredom disappears, their anxieties fade into poetry. Eventually, all the surviving pieces begin to resemble legend. But tonight, you remain close enough to still hear the wet sandals against the floorboards. And somewhere beyond the rain-dark rooftops of Japan, another kind of figure is already moving quietly through the night. Dressed not in magical shadows, but in ordinary clothes, meant to avoid attention entirely. The hidden world of the shinobi waits patiently in the darkness ahead. The rain deepens as night settles more fully across Japan. Lanterns sway gently outside wooden shops, their paper walls glowing amber through the misty dark. Water gathers along the edges of curved roof tiles before slipping down in thin silver streams. Somewhere nearby, a dog barks once, then thinks better of it, and falls silently again. You move carefully through a narrow street where almost every surface seems slightly damp. Sandals whisper softly against packed earth. The smell of charcoal smoke hangs low in the air beside traces of soy broth and wet cedar wood. This is usually the moment where popular imagination expects a ninja to appear. Perhaps dressed entirely in black, perhaps crouching dramatically on a rooftop beneath the moon, with impossible balance and deeply theatrical confidence. But real history is often less interested in dramatic entrances. A historical shinobi, the word more commonly used in older Japan, usually preferred not to be noticed at all. If someone pointed toward you and shouted, "There goes a ninja," then you were probably doing your job very badly. In truth, many shinobi operate more like spies, scouts, informants, and professional survivors than magical assassins. They gathered information, counted guards, spread rumors, started carefully timed fires, listened outside doors, bribed servants, memorized roads, watched weather patterns, and perhaps most important of all, they understood when to run away. Running away, historically speaking, has saved far more lives than dramatic last stands, although admittedly it receives fewer poems. You pause beneath the overhanging roof of a tea shop as rain thickens overhead. A tired merchant nearby mutters softly, while covering baskets with cloth. Two travelers hurry past carrying straw capes shiny with water. Nothing about the scene feels cinematic, and that is exactly why a shinobi could disappear inside it so easily. One of the strangest details about ninja mythology is the famous black outfit itself. Modern audiences often imagine it as authentic stealth clothing, but historians believe much of that image came from Japanese theater. Stagehands in traditional plays sometimes wore black because audiences were trained to mentally ignore them, treating them as invisible. Eventually, theatrical productions began using similarly dressed characters for stealthy assassins and spies, and over time, the theater quietly drifted into legend. Real infiltrators would more likely dress as monks, merchants, laborers, or wandering entertainers. Ordinary clothing was far safer than looking like a suspicious midnight acrobat. Besides, rooftops themselves were not nearly as graceful as films pretend. You can hear it now as rainwater taps unevenly across old wooden beams overhead. Houses creak constantly. Roof tiles shift. Loose boards complain loudly beneath pressure. Sneaking across rooftops at speed would often sound less like a deadly phantom and more like somebody struggling to move furniture upstairs in the middle of the night. Not ideal for secrecy. In the mountain regions of Iga and Koga, families connected to espionage traditions develop reputations for stealth and intelligence work. Manuals later collected in texts like the Banzenshukai described surprisingly practical concerns. How to observe enemy camps, how to interpret weather, how to survive difficult terrain, how to blend into crowds without attracting attention. Very little about magical vanishing, quite a lot about patience and damp socks. You leave the village roads now and follow a narrow forest trail, climbing gradually uphill beneath tall cedar trees. Fog drifts quietly between the trunks. Pine needles darken under steady rain. Somewhere deeper in the woods, water rushes over stones in a hidden stream. Ahead, a man walks slowly beneath a woven hat, carrying baskets of vegetables balanced across a pole. Nothing about him appears unusual. His shoulders sag slightly with the posture of someone used to long roads and uncomfortable weather. But as he entered a nearby town, his eyes moved constantly. He notices which gate guards appear bored, which soldiers are drinking, which dogs bark at strangers, which storehouses remain unlocked, which alleyways stay darkest after sunset. By dawn, he will leave carrying far more valuable information than vegetables. That quiet observational skill mattered enormously during the long years of Japanese conflict. Rival lords depended on information almost as desperately as they depended on swords. An army marching blindly through mountain roads could vanish into disaster very quickly. A hidden supply route might matter more than battlefield courage. A single fire set at the correct moment could spread panic faster than arrows. War, unfortunately, has always been deeply interested in logistics, even when storytellers prefer honor. You step briefly into a roadside inn, where travelers dry themselves beside low firelight. Steam rises from damp clothing. Someone coughs softly near the corner. Another guest snores already beneath a blanket, despite the noise around him. A woman ladles thin soup into wooden bowls while listening carefully to conversations without appearing nearby to listen at all. Information travels in fragments here. Names, rumors, troop movements, complaints, prices of rice, illness, weather farther north. A skilled shinobi understands that ordinary people often reveal important truths accidentally, not through torture or dramatic interrogation. Usually through the neck. The fire crackles softly while outside the storm begins easing into lighter rain. You can almost feel the strange loneliness of this hidden profession now. To survive, a shinobi often needed to become forgettable. No famous armor, no heroic banners, no grand declarations, just another traveler moving quietly between dangerous places. History remembers kings because they wanted attention. It remembers spies mostly because something went wrong. Far away now, in a castle lit by rows of trembling candles, a shogun studies reports from nervous officials. One daimyo grows restless in the north, another delayed taxes in the west. Messengers arrive muddy and sleep-deprived after days on the road. Somewhere beyond the mountains, rumors of rebellion drift slowly toward the capital, like distant thunder. And beneath all the layers of rituals and silk, the country feels fragile enough that even whispers matter. The hidden men crossing wet roads tonight understand that very well, because behind every beautiful age in history, someone is always staying awake long enough to listen carefully in the dark. By morning, the rain has softened into a gray mist hanging low over the city. The rooftops still glisten faintly with moisture, and thin trails of smoke rise from kitchens where rice already steams gently inside iron pots. Somewhere nearby, a broom scratches slowly across wet stone, while merchants begin lifting wooden shutters for another long day. You walk toward the center of power now, though power itself falls rarely as magnificent from nearby as it does looks in paintings. The castle ahead is enormous, certainly, with layered roofs curving upward like dark wings against the pale sky. Guards stand beside gates, wearing lacquered armor that smells faintly of oil and damp leather. But the deeper you travel inside, the more the place begins to resemble an overworked administrative machine, rather than a glorious palace of warriors. Messengers hurry through corridors, carrying bundles of documents tied carefully with cord. Officials kneel over tax records while rubbing tired eyes. Ink brushes scratch endlessly against paper. Sandals whisper across polished wood floors, in rhythms so repetitive they almost become hypnotic. Somewhere, someone important is always waiting for another report. This was the strange reality of the shogun's world. Popular culture often imagines the shogun as something almost divine, a supreme military ruler sitting calmly above the entire country like a mountain untouched by weather. But real shoguns often resemble exhausted efforts attempting to prevent thousands of armed nobles from creating disasters simultaneously. And honestly, that would give almost anyone headaches. By the early Tokugawa period, beginning in the early 1600s, Japan had finally emerged from generations of brutal civil war. The country was technically unified beneath the Tokugawa shogunate, centered in Edo, the city that would later become modern Tokyo. Yet peace did not magically erase danger. It simply transformed danger into paperwork. A daimyo, one of the powerful regional lords ruling domains across Japan, still controlled land, castles, soldiers, and enormous agricultural wealth. Many had fought against each other only years earlier. Trust remains thin in places, like cracked ice over dark water. So, the Tokugawa government built systems designed not only to govern Japan, but to exhaust ambitious nobles before they could rebel successfully. One of the most famous policies was called Sankin Kotai, though people living through it probably experienced it less as elegant political theory and more as endless expensive travel. Under this system, daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo while maintaining residences, both there and back home in their own domains. Their families often remain in Edo permanently, partly as honored guests and partly as very polite hostages. The journeys themselves became enormous processes. Hundreds of retainers marched along crowded roads, carrying banners, supplies, armor, documents, gifts, and carefully protected reputations. Villagers stopped to watch them pass in long winding lines, stretching through misty valleys and coastal roads. It looked impressive. It also quietly drains money at astonishing speed. Maintaining 2 household items, supporting retainers, organizing travel, repairing roads, and preserving appearances forced many daimyo into deep financial strain. Some borrowed heavily from merchants whom they officially outranked socially, but privately depended upon economics. There is something gently amusing about a warrior aristocracy, trying very hard to look dignified while nervously owing money to rice brokers. Inside the castle, you step into a narrow room where several officials kneel beside stacks of ledgers. The air smells faintly of paper dust, candle wax, and old tatami straw. One clerk coughs softly into his sleeve before continuing to copy tax figures with exhausted precision. A mistake here could create real consequences. Rice production formed the backbone of the economy, and wealth was often measured in koku, a unit roughly representing enough rice to feed one person for a year. Entire political relationships depend on harvest estimates, land surveys, irrigation reports, and taxation records. Feudal Japan, beneath all its swords and banners, was held together by accounting. Outside, thunder murmurs faintly beyond distant hills, while rainwater drips steadily from roof edges into stone channels below. A young messenger arrives soaked from travel, kneeling quickly to deliver news from another province. A bridge has collapsed after flooding. Repairs will require laborers and additional funds. Nearby farmers complain about rising taxes. A local official requests permission to punish smugglers operating along the coast. None of this sounds particularly cinematic. Unfortunately for the shogunate, it was most of governing. You begin to understand now why so many samurai during peaceful centuries became bureaucrats almost by necessity. There simply were not enough wars to occupy them all. Many spent their days studying Confucian philosophy, supervising storehouses, maintaining records, teaching martial arts, or attending ceremonies so elaborate they could probably qualify as endurance competitions. Some historians quietly joke that Edo Japan transformed warriors into administrators carrying swords, mostly because nobody quite knew what else to do with them. Not every samurai adapted comfortably to peace. In a side courtyard, an older retainer named Masanori sits alone beneath the overhang of a wooden walkway, listening to rain strike the garden stones below. His armor rests nearby, carefully polished, despite years without battle. Most mornings now involve reviewing warehouse inventories and mediating arguments about irrigation canals. When he was younger, he imagined glory. Instead, he became very knowledgeable about grain storage. Yet perhaps there is dignity in that too. Because peace, even fragile peace, requires enormous invisible labor. Roads must remain passable. Rice must move safely. Bridges must stand. Floods must be managed. Fires must be controlled before entire districts vanish beneath smoke and ash. Edo streets itself, crowded with wooden buildings and narrow, was terrifyingly dangerous to fire. A single accident could spread destruction across entire neighborhoods with fearful speed. In the year 1657, the Great Fire of Maireki killed tens of thousands of people and left much of the city blackened and broken. The elegant world of painted screens and silk robes exists constantly beyond catastrophe. That awareness shaped Japanese aesthetics deeply. The quiet sadness found in ideas like Mono no Aware. The gentle awareness that all beautiful things eventually fade, emerging because partly impermanence surrounds daily life so completely. A blossoming fall, a city burns, a powerful clan disappears within a generation. Even the shogun's authority, despite all ceremonies, depends on maintaining balance between competing forces that never fully stopped moving beneath the surface. You walk now through one final corridor, where lantern light flickers softly against dark wooden beams. Somewhere ahead, officials continue debating taxes, while outside the rain slowly begins to clear. Beyond the heavy castle walls, another world waits entirely. One filled not with administrators and ledgers, but with music, silk, practiced laughter, and women carefully trained to preserve beauty in a society constantly afraid of losing it. By evening, the rain had finally stopped. The streets still shimmer faintly beneath lantern light, and cool air drifts slowly through the city, carrying the mixed scents of charcoal smoke, river water, and food cooking somewhere nearby. Wooden signs creak gently overhead. From deeper within the entertainment districts comes the faint sound of shamisen music. Delicate and careful, like footsteps across thin ice, you move towards that music now. The pleasure quarters of Edo, Japan, exists almost like separate little worlds folded inside the larger city. Officially controlled, heavily regulated, and crowded with tea houses, restaurants, performers, servants, merchants, guards, and wealthy clients, trying very hard to appear calmer than they actually felt. Popular culture often collapses all of this into a single image, the geisha, and usually an informed one. In much of the modern world, geisha are still mistakenly imagined as courtesans, but historically, geisha were professional entertainers, trained in music, dance, poetry, conversation, etiquette, and the exhausting art of managing atmosphere itself. Which may sound simple until you realize how difficult it is to make nervous, powerful men relax without embarrassing them. That is a skill powerful enough to build an entire career upon. You remove your fur sandals at the entrance of a tea house, where warm light spills softly across polished wood floors. Inside, the room smells faintly of incense and fresh tatami mats. A kettle murmurs quietly over heat, while guests settle into carefully arranged positions that somehow appear natural, despite requiring years of social training to perfection. Everything here is performance, not fake exactly, but shaped, guided, smoothed carefully like river stones worn down by water over many years. A young apprentice named Aiko kneels near the corner of the room holding a shamisen across her lap. Her sleeves are long and heavy with embroidery. Layers of silk wrap around her body, with enough weight that even walking gracefully requires practice. Earlier that afternoon, she spent nearly an hour learning how to pour tea correctly without exposing nervousness in her hands. Tomorrow she will practice smiling while tired, an underrated historical skill. The training of a geisha can begin young and continue for years. Music, dance, poetry, conversation, posture, seasonal etiquette, calligraphy, and social awareness all mattered. A successful geisha needed to read emotional tension instantly. She needed to notice which guest felt insecure, which conversation risked becoming dangerous, which joke would calm the room, and which silence should remain untouched. In some ways, she functioned less like a fantasy figure and more like a highly trained emotional diplomat. Outside the tea house, wooden lanterns sway gently in the night breeze, while distant laughter drifts through narrow alleyways lined with restaurants and tea shops. Wealthy merchants arrive in expensive robes, designed carefully not to look too expensive. Samurai officials pretend not to worry about debts. Poets compose elegant lines while secretly hoping someone important overhears them. Entire evenings unfold through ritualized performance. The famous oiran occupied a different world entirely. Unlike geisha, elite oiran were high-ranking courtesans whose appearances themselves became enormous cultural events. Their processes through the streets, slowly and deliberately, almost like living theater, moved. Towering wooden sandals lift them high above muddy roads, while layers upon layers of silk shimmered beneath lantern glow. Hair ornaments flashed softly with gold and lacquer as attendants followed behind, carrying belongings and adjusting robes. People gathered simply to watch them pass. In modern language, they resemble something between celebrities and moving luxury brands. Although formidable, with heaviest footwear, you stand now beside a crowded street, while one of these processes moves carefully through the district. The oiran's steps are slow, because the tall sandals demand extraordinary balance. Her robes rustle softly with each movement, carrying the faint scent of incense and powder through cool night air. Nearby spectators fall almost completely silent as she passes, not because the world has suddenly become peaceful, but because beauty, when carefully staged, can temporarily quiet exhaustion. That mattered deeply in Edo Japan. This was a society where earthquakes, fires, famines, political pressure, rigid hierarchy, and constant social expectations shaped daily life. The entertainment offered carefully controlled moments of escape from all that tension. Behind paper screens, people could briefly imagine themselves more elegant, more poetic, perhaps even more emotionally understood than ordinary life usually allowed. Although the illusion requires enormous labor from the people maintaining it, Aiko finishes her song quietly while guests murmur approval. Her knees ache slightly from kneeling. Beneath carefully painted makeup, she is still simply a tired young woman trying not to make mistakes in front of important strangers. History often remembers beauty while forgetting the muscles required to hold it upright. In another room nearby, two merchants discussed loans over cups of sake while pretending they were only casually chatting. A samurai laughs too loudly at a joke because he desperately needs the evening to feel successful. Somewhere upstairs, a servant rushes to replace spilled tea before anyone important notices. The entire district runs on invisible effort. Even fashion carries itself hidden meanings. Kimono colors shifted with seasons. Patterns suggest age, status, personality, or current trends. A misplaced detail might quietly signal ignorance. Wealthy classes develop refined aesthetic rules, partly because elegance became one of the few socially acceptable ways to display power. Without proactive threat stability, beauty became politics. You hear distant sandals approaching along the wooden walkway outside. Rainwater still drips occasionally from roof edges, though the clouds have begun slowly clearing above the city. Somewhere farther away, a temple bell sounds low and gentle through the night. Inside the tea house, conversations soften. Several guests prepare to leave, while servants quietly clear dishes beneath flickering candlelight. Aiko finally allows herself one small sigh once the room empties. Tomorrow she will begin again. Another performance. Another evening, balancing grace, exhaustion, and expectation beneath the warm glow of lanterns. And outside these carefully arranged worlds of silk and music, thousands of wandering men continue drifting along dark roads with no stable home at all. Former samurai, failed retainers, unemployed swordsmen, sleeping beneath temple roofs and surviving one uncertain season at a time. Because not everyone in feudal Japan belongs inside beauty. Some people simply walked beside it in the rain. Historical focus. Ronin realities, unemployment, wandering samurai, unstable identity, survival work, social anxiety around masterless warriors. Morning arrives pale and cold beneath a sky the color of watered ink. Thin mist clings to the roads outside Edo, while travelers move slowly between baskets, tools, bundles of cloth, and the small private worries that seem to follow human beings through every century of history. You walk along one of those roads now. The earth beneath your sandals feels uneven from yesterday's rain, and wheel tracks left by supply carts have hardened overnight into rough ridges of mud. Somewhere ahead, a crow calls from a pine branch, while smoke rises lazily from a roadside cooking fire. The smell of broth drifts softly through the chilly air. A man sits alone near the edge of the road, with a sword resting beside him. At first glance, he resembles the familiar image of the wandering samurai so beloved in films and novels. His cloak moves gently in the wind. His expression is calm. His posture still carries traces of military discipline, but when you sit close enough to notice the frayed edges of his sleeves and the careful way he stretches a sore knee before standing, something more ordinary begins to emerge. He is tired. This man is a ronin, a masterless samurai. The word carries itself enormous weight in Japanese history and modern storytelling alike. Popular culture often transforms ronin into romantic lone wolf, drifting freely through the world, with perfect swordsmanship and mysterious personal codes. Some certainly tried to live that way. Many others were simply unemployed. During long centuries of political change, especially after the wars ended and domains reorganized, large numbers of samurai lost their positions. Their lords died, fell from power, lost land, or were punished by the shogunate. Suddenly, men trained for military service found themselves without stable income, social purpose, or clear futures. A little like discovering your entire profession has quietly disappeared while you were still sharpening your tools. The ronin beside the road finally stands and walks towards a small noodle stall near the village entrance. Steam curls upward into cold air, while the owner ladles thin broth into wooden bowls. Nearby workers eat quickly before returning to work. Nobody seems particularly impressed by the sword. That happened more often than stories usually admit. By the peaceful Edo years, wandering armed men could make authorities nervous. Some ronin became teachers, guards, bodyguards, scribes, or minor officials. Others drifted through temporary jobs, gambling, mercenary work, or outright banditry. A few struggled with deep shame, because samurai identity depended heavily upon loyalty and service to a lord. Without that structure, many feel socially suspended between classes. Too proud to become peasants, too poor to remain comfortably elite. The noodle seller places a bowl before the ronin, who bows politely before eating slowly. His name is Jiro. Once, years ago, he served a small regional lord, whose castle overlooked cedar forests far to the north. But political alliances shift after a conflict between neighboring domains. His lord lost standing. Stipends disappeared. The castle retainers scattered like leaves in strong wind. Now Jiro survives mostly by teaching basic swordsmanship to merchant sons whenever possible. Sometimes he escorts caravans along dangerous roads. Sometimes he sleeps in temples, if the monks are kind enough to allow it. Sometimes he goes hungry quietly, because dignity can become strangely expensive. Around him, village life continues with practical indifference. Farmers repair fences. Children chase each other through muddy paths. A merchant argued loudly about the price of charcoal. Dogs bark. Someone coughs from inside a nearby house. History rarely pauses dramatic for personal tragedy. The famous story of the 47 Ronin helped transform masterless samurai into symbols of loyalty and sacrifice within Japanese cultural memory. In the early 1700s, after their lord was forced to commit ritual suicide following conflict at court, his former retainers spent months carefully planning revenge before surrendering themselves to authorities. The story became legendary because it seemed to preserve samurai honor within an increasingly fading age. But real ronin life was usually much less poetic. You continue walking with Jiro as the road bends gradually through farmland shimmering faintly beneath morning frost. Rice fields lie quiet now between growing seasons, flat and silver beneath the pale sky. He speaks very little, although occasionally he glances toward passing travelers. With the alert caution of someone accustomed to uncertainty, a Ronin could never fully relax. Too many officials distrusted wandering swordsmen. Too many inns charged higher prices for armed guests. Too many people assumed that a man without a master must also lack stability. And unfortunately, some Ronin did become dangerous, especially during periods of famine or economic strain. Social anxiety followed them closely. At midday, you both stop beside a roadside shrine where small paper prayers flutter gently in the breeze. Jiro removes his sandals and rubs his feet slowly. The straw has worn thin enough that the cold ground presses through clearly now. Across the road, another traveler asks if he might demonstrate sword techniques for a local school in the next village. The pay sounds modest. Jiro accepts immediately. There is something quietly heartbreaking about highly trained warriors, temporary teaching jobs beside muddy roads. And yet, there is also resilience there, because survival itself becomes a discipline after long enough. As afternoon light softens across the hills, the two of you pass several Ashigaru soldiers, marching in loose formation toward another province. Their spears sway unevenly while packs bump against tired shoulders. One man yawns openly. Another limps slightly. They smell faintly of wet cloth, sweat and smoke from campfires, soaked by recent rain. Jiro watches them silent for a moment. The old dream of glorious warfare has faded now into logistics, movement, hunger, and aching feet. Perhaps it was always mostly that beneath the poetry. By evening, you arrive at a small temple where travelers are allowed to sleep if they remain respectful and quiet. Wind moves softly through bamboo outside while candlelight flickers against old wooden pillars darkened by generations of smoke. Jiro places his sword carefully beside him before lying down near the wall. Nearby, another Ronin already sleeps beneath a worn blanket, with one hand still resting near the hilt of his weapon, out of long habit. Not heroic, just be careful. Outside, the wind continues drifting through the trees, while somewhere in the darkness, hundreds of ordinary feet continue marching slowly. Across Japan, soldiers carrying the true weight of its wars on exhausted shoulders. Long before sunrise, the camp is already awake. You hear it first through layers of darkness and fog. Low coughing, the rustle of straw blankets. Someone blew gently into half-dead embers to coax a fire back to life. Wooden bowls whisper softly together, the distant sound of horses, shifting restlessly somewhere beyond the rows of tents. The air smells of wet earth and smoke. Rain passed through during the night again, leaving the ground thick and heavy beneath your sandals. Mud clings stubbornly to everything here. Wheels, clothing, spear shafts, cooking pots, tired feet. It gathers around the edges of campfires in dark pools, reflecting faint orange light back toward the waking soldiers. This is the part of samurai warfare most legends politely step around, because wars are usually remembered through dramatic duels and famous commanders, but actual armies survive through labor, endless labor, walking, carrying, digging, cooking, repairing, hauling, waiting, marching, drying clothes, sharpening blades, burying waste, gathering firewood, and trying not to become sick before reaching the battlefield at all. And much of that burden rested upon the Ashigaru. The Ashigaru began previously as lightly equipped foot soldiers, many recruited from peasant backgrounds during the chaotic Sengoku centuries. Over time, they evolved into a far more organized military force. By the height of Japan's civil wars, enormous armies depended on them completely. Samurai may have carried prestige, but Ashigaru carries the war itself. You walk now between rows of weary men crouched beside breakfast fires. Most wear simple armor made from lacquered plates tied together with cord. It protects reasonably well, though not enough to stop discomfort from settling deep into shoulders and backs after weeks of travel. Damp cloth wraps around their feet beneath straw sandals already beginning to fray. Spears lean nearby in bundled clusters like thin forests waiting for daylight. One carefully soldier dries rice over low heat, while another rubs soreness from his wrists. A third sleeps sitting upright despite the noise around him, chin resting against his chest. Human beings, throughout history, have always been astonishingly capable of sleeping in terrible conditions. A veteran Ashigaru named Genjiro kneels near the edge of camp repairing a broken sandal strap with practiced fingers. His face is weathered from years outdoors. Smoke curls slowly past him while pale dawn light spreads gradually across distant hills. When Genjiro was young, he imagined warfare would feel heroic. Instead, it mostly feels damp. Still, there is pride here too. Not romantic pride exactly, but the quieter kind that grows from endurance. Ashigaru marched extraordinary distances, carrying weapons, armor, supplies, and survival tools through mountains, forests, flooded roads, and freezing winters. Some campaigns lasted months. Disease often kills more soldiers than combat itself. Hunger traveled with armies constantly like an unwelcome companion. And then there was the mud. Always the mud. You follow the column later that morning, as thousands of feet move slowly along a narrow road carved between rice fields and wooded hillsides. Rainwater splashes beneath sandals. Supply carts sink heavily into soft ground while laborers strain beside the wheels. Horses snort clouds of steam into cold air. Officers shout instructions, already half lost beneath the noise of movement. This is less a graceful military procession and more a giant exhausted animal trying to drag itself across the countryside. Yet despite the hardships, Ashigaru transformed Japanese warfare. Large field spear formations allow armies to enormous numbers of disciplined infantry. Matchlock firearms introduced during the 1600s added even more change. Famous commanders like Oda Nobunaga understood quickly that organized volleys of gunfire and coordinated infantry tactics could overpower older styles of elite mounted combat. History, unfortunately for aristocrats everywhere, tends to favor organization eventually. At midday, the army pauses beside a river swollen from recent rain. Soldiers remove helmets to cool themselves, while cooks distribute simple meals of rice and thin soup. Steam rises gently into the gray air. Nearby, several Ashigaru quietly gamble with small coins scratched and worn from years of use. One man laughs after losing, though mostly because the alternative feels too tiring. Genjiro sits beside the riverbank, cleaning mud carefully from the base of his spear. He tells another soldier about his wife back home, who repairs fishing nets during winter to earn extra money. He worries about taxes this year because flooding damaged nearby fields before the campaign even began. War does not pause ordinary life. It simply stretches worry across greater distances. Farther down the line, several samurai ride horseback, inspecting troop formations. Their armor appears more elaborate, decorated with crests and polished lacquer, reflecting faint light through drifting mist. But even they look exhausted. One horse limped slightly. Another samurai struggles quietly to stay awake in the saddle after days without proper rest. The old fantasy of perfectly composed warriors becomes harder to maintain when everybody smells faintly of rainwater and smoke. You continue, marching into afternoon, while clouds gather again overhead. Somewhere ahead, scouts report enemy movement beyond the hills. Immediately, the atmosphere shifts. Conversations soften. Hands tighten around spear shafts. Officers begin reorganizing units more carefully. Fear moves through armies quietly at first. Not dramatic screaming, usually quiet. A younger Ashigaru beside you swallows nervously while adjusting the cords beneath his helmet for the third time in only a few minutes. Another mutters a short prayer beneath his breath. Genjiro simply keeps walking. Years of campaigning have taught him something important. Battles are rarely won by the angry men. More often, they are won by the soldiers who remain functional slightly longer than everyone else. That truth sounds almost disappointingly practical, which is probably why legends avoid mentioning it. By evening, rain begins once more. Fires struggle against damp wind while soldiers huddle beneath rough shelters made from cloth and wood poles. Wet armor hangs nearby, drying poorly. Somewhere in the darkness, someone sings softly and badly enough that several men nearby started laughing despite themselves. The sound spreads through camp gently. For a few moments, exhaustion loosens its grip a little. Genjiro lies back against bundled supplies, staring upward into darkness, where rain taps steadily overhead. Tomorrow may bring battle, or another march, or another week of waiting beside muddy roads while commanders argue over strategy, far away inside dry tents. Most soldiers throughout history spent far more time waiting than fighting. And somewhere beyond these weary camps, powerful lords continue debating taxes, borders, alliances, and ambition, while ordinary men carry spears through the rain beneath them all. Rain falls again by the time you reach the mountain roads, not the violent kind carried by storms, but the slow, patient rain that seems capable of lasting forever. Mist gathers between cedar trees while narrow paths wind upward, through dark hills, where temple roofs emerge only gradually from the fog, like old ships appearing at sea. Water drips steadily from moss-covered stones. Somewhere ahead, bells sound softly through damp air. You follow the sound uphill. The great wars of Japan are often remembered through banners, cavalry charges, famous swords, and dramatic betrayals. But once you move closer to the actual machinery holding society together, another reality appears beneath the legend. Everybody is repairing something. Roads collapse after floods, bridges rot, rice fields overflow, storehouse leaks, taxes arrive late, messengers disappear, retainers complain about stipends, villages argue over irrigation canals, monasteries demand exemptions, merchants demand repayment, and somewhere in the middle of all this stands the daimyo, trying very hard not to let the entire domain unravel at once. A daimyo was more than simply a warlord. In practice, many became exhausted managers of unstable miniature countries. Their days involved military obligations, certainly, but also harvest estimates, flood repairs, criminal disputes, diplomacy, budgets, construction projects, road maintenance, and endless negotiations between people who disliked one another intensely while pretending otherwise in public. Power often looks graceful from far away because servants are cleaning constantly behind the curtains. You arrive now at the outer grounds of a provincial castle, where rainwater streams from curved rooftops into overflowing drainage channels below. Guards stand beneath wooden gatehouses, trying unsuccessfully to stay dry. Their armor smells faintly of lacquer, wet cloth, and old sweat trapped inside layers of silk cord. Inside, the atmosphere feels less triumphant than overworked. Clerks kneel aside stacks of damp reports weighted carefully with stones to stop the paper curling in the humidity. A nervous official explains that recent storms damaged 2 bridges along a trade route. Rice shipments may be delayed. Farmers already complain that taxes remain too high after poor harvests last season. Meanwhile, rumors spread that a nearby monastery is sheltering armed men. Of course it is. The relationship between religion violence and in medieval Japan was far more complicated than modern fantasies usually suggest. Certain Buddhist monasteries grew enormously wealthy and politically influential over time, controlling land, labor, taxation rights, and military forces. Warrior monks, often called Sohei, defended temple interests with surprising intensity whenever necessary. Peaceful meditation and armed confrontation occasionally exist side by side, with very little warning between them. You continue deeper into the hills, where temple buildings cling to the mountainside beneath tall dark trees. Smoke drifts upward from incense burners, while rain taps softly against wooden walkways, polished smooth by centuries of sandals. Young monks carry buckets through the mist, while chanting rises low and rhythmic from somewhere farther inside the complex. At first, everything feels calm. Then you notice the weapons. Bundles of spears lean beneath covered storage areas. Armed retainers move quietly between buildings. Several monks themselves wear practical traveling clothes beneath outer robes designed for ceremony. One older monk blesses departing fighters beside the gate before calmly adjusting the sword at his own waist and joining them moments later. History rarely separates spirituality and politics as neatly as modern people prefer. Some monasteries became so influential that powerful warlords considered them genuine threats. During the violent Sengoku years, religious institutions occasionally acted almost like heavily armed political corporations with prayer halls attached. They negotiated alliances, protected territory, collected wealth, and sometimes pushed openly into conflict. And because this is history, many of them are also endlessly argued about money. You pause beneath a covered walkway while cold rain drifts beyond the temple garden. Water gathers inside stone basins. Wind moves softly through bamboo nearby, with a dry, whispering sound. A young acolyte kneels carefully beside shelves of damaged scrolls rescued after a recent roof leak. He separates pages one by one so they can dry properly before mold spreads further. Even preserving knowledge requires maintenance. Down below in the valley, the daimyo's officials continue calculating labor obligations for repairing flood barriers before spring planting begins. Farmers will complain, certainly. But if the barriers fail entirely, the harvest could collapse. If the harvest collapses, taxes collapse with it. If taxes collapse, retainers go unpaid. And armed men have historically been one of civilization's least relaxing problems. Everything connects. That is the true hidden architecture beneath feudal Japan. Not just castles and swords, but systems delicately balanced upon agriculture, weather, transportation, labor, and human cooperation that often functioned only because people were too exhausted to destroy everything at once. By evening, fog thickens across the mountains, while lanterns glow softly inside castle windows below. You sit briefly beside an aging administrator named Lord Hayato, as servants refill tea that has already gone cold twice from neglect. He studies reports silently for several moments before rubbing tired eyes. One village requests grain relief after flooding. Another asks permission to rebuild a damaged shrine. Two minor retainers nearly fought a duel over insults exchanges during a ceremony. A merchant caravan disappears somewhere along a forest road. No single disaster seems large enough to destroy the domain, but together, they never stop arriving. Hayato once imagined leadership would feel glorious. Instead, it feels like trying to keep a leaking roof standing during endless rainstorms, using paper records and increasingly nervous conversations. Outside, thunder rolls softly through distant hills. Somewhere farther up the mountain, temple bells answer slowly through the mist. Smoke from cooking fires drifts between cedar branches, while peasants below continue repairing irrigation channels in fading light, because tomorrow's rice still depends on tonight's labor. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath so much of Japanese history. The elegant castles, the painted screens, the ceremonial robes, the refined poetry, all of it rested upon countless ordinary people, endlessly maintaining a fragile world before it could fall apart again. Some with swords, some with prayer beads, and many with mud still drying on their hands. The rain finally clears sometime before dawn. When morning arrives, the countryside glows softly beneath low drifting clouds, every surface washed clean and shining faintly with moisture. Rice fields stretch across the valley like mirrors broken into careful squares, reflecting pale silver light back toward the waking sky. Frogs murmur lazily from irrigation ditches. Somewhere nearby, water wheels creak with slow, patient rhythm as the day begins again. You stand ankle-deep in mud beside farmers already at work. This is the foundation beneath almost everything you have seen so far. Beneath the castles, beneath the silk robes, beneath the swords, temples, processes, and political rituals, rice, always rice. In feudal Japan, rice was more than food. It shaped taxation, status, wealth, political authority, military support, and survival itself. Entire domains measured prosperity through harvest yields. Samurai stipends often depend upon rice income. Villages lived under constant pressure to produce enough grain, not only for themselves, but also for distant officials who would never touch the mud personally. The earth here feels cold beneath your feet, while farmers bend silently over young shoots planted in careful rows. Their hats shield them from sunlight, already growing warmer through thinning clouds. Water reflects fragments of sky around their legs while insects drift lazily above the paddies. It is beautiful and deeply exhausting. A farmer named Taro lifts another bundle of seedlings from a woven basket while rubbing stiffness from his lower back. His hands move automatically now after years of repetition. Plant, step, press, plant again. Around him, family members work with the same quiet concentration because falling behind could even briefly affect the harvest months later. The rhythm of agricultural life leaves little room for romantic fantasies. Earlier this year, flooding damaged several nearby fields. Last winter had been unusually cold. Taxes remain heavy, yet work continues stopping because solves nothing. History often survives through people too stubborn to quit. Near the edge of the field, Taro's wife kneels beside a small wooden box, carefully hidden beneath folded cloth. Inside rests part of the household's remaining rice reserve, not exactly stolen, simply protected quietly from the endless appetite of taxation and uncertainty. Her patched sleeves brush softly against the floor as she counts supplies by lantern light later that evening. Rice, pickled vegetables, dried fish, lamp oil, thread, firewood. Winter always arrives eventually, no matter how elegant the poetry becomes. You travel now toward Edo itself, where narrow streets already pulse with movement long before midday. Porters carry goods balanced across wooden poles. Vendors shout prices from crowded stalls beneath hanging banners. Smoke rises from cooking fires, while the smell of grilled fish mixes with soy broth, damp wood, river, air, and the faint, sharp scent of ink from nearby printing shops. The city feels alive in a different way than the countryside, restless. Beneath the rigid social order of Tokugawa Japan, something quieter had begun growing steadily over generations. Commerce, trade, credits, urban wealth, merchant networks move money invisibly through the country like underground streams beneath stone. Officially, merchants occupied relatively low social status beneath samurai, peasants, and artisans. The ideal Confucian hierarchy promotes those who produce necessary goods rather than those who profit from exchange itself. Reality, however, tends to negotiate with money eventually. You step into a merchant house facing one of Edo's busier market streets. From outside, the building appears modest enough. Simple wood, narrow entrance, little visible luxury. But inside, hidden behind plain walls and sliding paper screens, wealth reveals itself quietly. Polished lacquer boxes, fine ceramics, silk cushions, delicate painted scrolls. Carefully arranged gardens no passerby can see from the street. In many merchant families, displaying abundant wealth openly risked attracting criticism or official attention. So elegance moved inward instead, concealed behind restrained public appearances, a little like expensive secrets arranged neatly beside teacups. The merchant overseeing this house is named Ichiro. His robe appears simple at first glance, though the fabric quality quietly suggests otherwise. He bows politely while reviewing ledgers spread across low tables, covered with meticulous columns of brush-written numbers. Nearby assistants calculate loans, shipping costs, warehouse inventories, and rice futures with astonishing precision. No armor hangs on these walls. Yet enormous portions of the country depends upon work happening inside rooms, exactly like this one. Many samurai families, despite their status, struggled financially during long peace. Merchant lenders provided credit. Cities expanded through commercial activity. Entertainment districts flourished because urban populations possessed disposable income. Even some daimyo became quietly dependent on merchant networks to maintain appearances and cover debt. Status remains visible above ground. Money L. Outside, afternoon sunlight warms crowded streets, while apprentices between hastily shops carrying bundles of paper, cloth, tea, candles, and account books. Somewhere nearby, a storyteller gathers listeners beside a bridge. A group of children chase one another through drifting smoke from a noodle stand. The city hums constantly with exchange. Goods, information, gossip, credits, ambition. You notice how carefully people perform social roles here. Merchants bow deeply to samurai customers despite privately controlling enormous financial resources. Samurai maintains formal dignity while quietly borrowing money. Everyone preserves appearances because stability depends partly upon continuing the performance. Society itself begins to resemble a carefully staged theater production where half the actors secretly manage the budget backstage. As evening settles over Edo, lanterns bloom one by one across the streets, while cool air drifts inward from the river. Inside his home, Ichiro's daughter practices calligraphy beside softly glowing candlelight. In another district, Taro's wife finishes repairing worn clothing while counting hidden rice supplies again before sleeping. Different worlds, yet connected completely, because the refined beauty often associated with Edo Japan did not emerge from endless peace and comfort. It emerged from systems of labor so constant that people learned to hide exhaustion beneath ritual, politeness, craftsmanship, and restraint. Even beauty itself became a kind of survival skill. Outside, the wind moves gently through bamboo fences, while somewhere far away, temple bells echo faintly across dark water. The city slowly quiets, though never completely. Beneath the floors of merchant houses, beneath patched blankets in farming villages, beneath the polished ceremonies of the ruling class, the entire country continues breathing through work almost nobody remembers clearly enough. And still, despite the hardships, people continue creating gardens, poems, tea bowls, songs, and careful moments of peace. Not because life was easy, but because it wasn't. Night rain settles softly across Edo once more. Not rushing rain, not violent rain, just the steady whisper of water, moving through darkness while lanterns glow behind paper windows and distant footsteps fade gradually into silence. Somewhere in the city, a kettle hums over low heat. Somewhere else, a tired servant closes wooden shutters against damp wind drifting inward from the river. The world feels temporary tonight, and perhaps that feeling sits closer to the heart of feudal Japan than swords ever did. Popular imagination often remembers old Japan through elegance alone. Cherry blossoms drifting through spring air, quiet temples surrounded by moss, tea ceremonies performed with calm precision, beautiful calligraphy brushed slowly onto pale paper. But those images make more sense once you understand how fragile life often felt beneath them. For centuries, Japan endured earthquakes, floods, fires, famines, epidemics, storms, and civil wars severe enough to erase entire neighborhoods, families, and fortunes almost overnight. Cities built largely from wood burned frighteningly easily. A single overturned lantern during dry weather could become catastrophe before dawn. Beauty survived partly because permanence did not. You walk now through a narrow Edo street sometime after midnight. Rainwater reflects lantern light in trembling gold patterns beneath your feet. The smell of wet ash still lingers faintly here because only months earlier this district suffered a serious fire. Several homes remain blackened skeletons against the darkness while nearby families already rebuild with patient determination. There is surprisingly little dramatic outrage. Most people simply begin again. An old carpenter kneels beneath a covered awning, smoothing fresh cedar boards with slow, deliberate care. Beside him, a child sleeps, wrapped in blankets while soft rain taps gently overhead. Tomorrow these boards will become part of another house, standing where another house once disappeared into smoke. History often moves forward through rebuilding more than triumph. Inside a nearby tea house, steam rises quietly from small ceramic cups repaired long ago with thin seams of gold lacquer. This practice, known today as kintsugi, treated cracks not as damage to hide completely, but as part of an object's continuing story. The bowl survived breaking, therefore the break itself became visible. There is something deeply human about that idea. Not perfect restoration. Survival with scars that remain softly illuminated. A woman refills tea carefully, while guests warm their hands beside low candlelight. Outside, the wind stirs the branches of a cherry tree growing beside the canal. Several blossoms drift downward into muddy water, where they float briefly beneath reflections of lanterns, before disappearing into darkness. Mono no aware, often translated gently as an awareness of impermanence, grew from experiences exactly like this. Not abstract philosophy, floating high above ordinary life, but emotional familiarity with the fact that beautiful moments pass quickly, because everything passes quickly. The blossom rooms, the seasons change, the city burns, the family rebuilds, and somehow people continue arranging flowers beside open windows anyway. You travel farther north now into the countryside, still recovering from poor harvests several years earlier. The road winds between quiet villages, where the roof sags slightly from weather and age. In one home, Taro's wife hangs carefully mended clothing beside the fire, while outside winter wind rattles bamboo fences in uneven rhythms. Rice supplies remain lower than she prefers. Several neighbors already rely heavily upon millet and thin soups until spring arrives again. Yet, even here, someone has placed a tiny arrangement of winter branches near the doorway, simply because it looks beautiful against the snow. Human beings continue to decorate fragile worlds with astonishing persistence. The concept later called wabi-sabi emerged gradually from similar emotional landscapes: simplicity, imperfections, weathered surfaces, quiet age, the soft beauty of things incomplete, temporary, or worn by time. Not luxury untouched by hardships. Beauty shaped directly by hardship itself. You see it everywhere once you begin noticing. The rough texture of old wood, polished smooth by millions of hands. The sound of rain moving through temple gardens, designed specifically to feel peaceful during storms. The careful silence of tea ceremonies, creating moments of order inside uncertain times. Even poetry itself often focuses less on grand victory than on fleeting details easily lost if nobody paused long enough to observe them. A crow lifting from snowy branches, smoke fading above distant roofs, the smell of wet earth after rain. Far away in the capital, wealthy officials still attend elaborate ceremonies beneath painted screens, while merchants continue balancing ledgers late into the evening. Samurai still worried about status. Farmers still worry about harvests. Monks still ring bells through fog-covered mountains. Life remains exhausting in many ordinary ways. But threaded through all of it runs this quieter understanding. Nothing lasts forever. Not power. Not beautiful. Not grief. Not even disaster. Perhaps that awareness explains why so much Japanese art feels simultaneously calm and sad, delicate and resilient. The people creating it already understood the world could vanish unexpectedly. Instead of denying impermanence, they built entire aesthetic traditions around promoting it gently. The rain eases before dawn. Mist drifts low across canals, while pale light slowly touches tiled roofs still dark from moisture. Somewhere nearby, a temple bell sounds once through the fading night. You remember the tired samurai calculating taxes beside candlelight, the disguised shinobi moving silently through crowded roads, Aiko practicing graceful conversation despite aching knees, Genjiro cleaning mud from his spear beside cold rivers, farmers hiding rice beneath floorboards while merchants quietly finance entire districts from behind modest walls, all of them living inside systems that appear elegant. Partly because everyone worked endlessly to prevent collapse. And now, as morning slowly approaches, feudal Japan itself begins to feel less like a perfect legend and more like something far more interesting. A fragile world held together by ritual, labor, exhaustion, beauty, and the stubborn human decision to keep rebuilding after the fires. Soon, the journey will continue westward into another medieval world entirely. One far louder, far dirtier, far more crowded. Because while Japan wrapped hardships in silence and ceremony, medieval Paris met suffering with noise, smoke, arguments, bells, mud, and streets so crowded that simply looking upward could occasionally become a survival skill. Morning arrives differently in medieval Paris. Japan often greets the dawn with mist, drifting quietly through cedar trees and temple, bells echoing across still water. Paris wakes up all at once, loudly. You hear it before you fully see it. Cart wheels grinding over uneven stone, horses snorting clouds of steam into cold air, vendors shouting across narrow streets already crowded before sunrise. Bells ringing from churches scattered throughout the city, like competing arguments made entirely of bronze. Somewhere nearby, a baby cries, while someone else curses at a stubborn mule. And beneath everything else flows the steady sound of the river Seine, moving through the center of the city, carrying boats, waste trade, rumors, fish, and occasional things people prefer not to identify too carefully. You stand now on a muddy street, not far from the crowded heart of medieval Paris. Sometime during the late Middle Ages, the air smells wonderfully alive and faintly dangerous at the same time. Fresh bread drifts from bakery ovens beside smoke from damp firewood, wet wool, horses, river mud, onions frying somewhere nearby, human sweat, fish scales, tallow candles. Cities before modern sanitation possessed very ambitious smell combinations. The buildings lean inward overhead so closely in places that upper floors nearly touch. Wooden beams jut above the street, while laundry hangs from windows, fluttering weakly in cold morning air. Rainwater from earlier storms still gathers in shallow puddles, reflecting pale gray light between patches of straw scattered across the road to absorb mud, waste, and whatever else the city dropped there overnight, which was often quite a lot. A woman named Margot balances baskets of bread against her hips while weaving expertly through the morning crowd. Her shoes are already wet. She no longer notices. There. She passes apprentices carrying barrels toward taverns. Priests move quickly toward early services. Laborers unloading fish near the river docks, and students remain awake from arguments that should probably have ended hours ago. Paris does not wake gently. It simply continues. By the Middle Ages, Paris had become one of Europe's largest and most influential cities. It was a center of trade, religion, scholarship, and royal authority. Tens of thousands of people crowded inside neighborhoods connected by winding streets that often grew organically rather than logically. New structures lean against older ones. Workshops pressed beside homes. Markets expanded wherever enough space remains available. The order existed, certainly, but mostly in theory. You follow Margot toward a bakery where heat pours outward from large ovens glowing orange inside dim stone walls. Bakers have already worked for hours by this point, because bread formed the foundation of urban survival. The smell inside is rich and comforting enough to briefly overpower the odors outside. Flour dust drifts through warm air, while apprentices carry heavy trays with sleepy concentration. One boy nearly falls asleep standing upright next to stacked loaves. History is full of exhausted teenagers carrying impossible amounts of bread. Outside again, church bells roll across the city in overlapping waves. Notre Dame rises in the distance above crowded rooftops, immense and solemn through drifting river fog. Construction on massive cathedrals often lasts generations. Entire lives pass beneath scaffolding, stone dust, and hammer strikes, while builders slowly transformed ambition into architecture. Paris constantly built upward because there was rarely enough room sideways. You move carefully through narrower alleys now, where gutters run beside the streets, carrying wastewater toward the river. Chickens dart between puddles. A pig noses through discarded scraps beside a doorway, while two women argue loudly from opposite windows overhead. Somewhere above you, shutters open suddenly. This was one reason experienced city residents learned not to stare upward too casually in medieval streets. People emptied chamber pots from windows, sometimes with warnings, sometimes with optimism. Urban survival requires alertness. The Seine itself serves as the city's lifeline. Boats crowd the riverbanks, carrying wine, grain, timber, stone, cloth, and millions of other goods, feeding Parisian life. Porters strain beneath enormous loads, while merchants negotiate prices beside docks, slick with mud and fish scales. Water wheels turn steadily near crowded bridges, with houses built directly atop them, their wooden frames creaking softly above the moving current below. The city feels less like a planned machine, and more like something organic, almost alive, growing unevenly in every direction at once. And like many living things, it occasionally smelled alarming. Yet, medieval people were not simply filthy caricatures, wandering blindly through dirt, as modern stereotypes sometimes suggest. Bathhouses exist, laundry mattered, streets were cleaned with varying success. Authorities attempted regulations, but population density, animals, smoke, waste disposal, and limited infrastructure made cleanliness an endless negotiation rather than a permanent achievement. Much like peace in feudal Japan, a light rain begins falling again near midday, turning the streets darker and softer beneath thousands of moving feet. Margot pulls her shawl tighter while hurrying toward another customer. Nearby, a butcher sharpens knives beneath a covered stall, while crows gather hopefully along nearby rooftops. The city never truly quiets. Even moments of calm contain movement beneath them. Bells, wheels, footsteps, water. Voices drifting from taverns. Distant hammering from workshops. Dogs barking somewhere beyond the fog. You step briefly inside a small church where candlelight flickers against cool stone walls scented faintly with incense and damp air. Several exhausted laborers kneel silently before returning to work outside. One man removes his cap slowly, while rainwater drips from the edge onto the floor below. Perhaps this is another thing. Great cities teaching people throughout history. When life becomes crowded enough, moments of stillness begin to feel sacred almost automatically. Outside again, Paris continues swelling noisily around you. Smoke rises from chimneys into low gray skies, while market stalls multiply through the afternoon. Somewhere ahead, university students already gather for arguments that may eventually become philosophical, drunken shouting, or both simultaneously. Most billion items. And by nightfall, the city will grow stranger still. By midday, Paris feels as though the entire city has decided to speak at once. The narrow streets swell with movement until simply walking forward becomes a slow negotiation between baskets, barrels, livestock, apprentices, priests, and citizens carrying objects heavy enough to inspire regret halfway through the journey. Rain from earlier has faded into low drifting clouds, leaving the stones slick beneath thousands of footsteps. You move toward the markets now, following the sounds before you even see them. Voices rise everywhere. Vendors calling prices, porters shouted warnings, blacksmiths hammering glowing iron. Merchants argued over weights and measures with the seriousness of diplomats preventing war. Somewhere nearby, geese complained loudly about being geese. The markets of medieval Paris were not quiet places of graceful browsing. They were survival performed at full volume. You arrive at Les Halles, one of the city's great market districts, where trade spills outward in every direction, beneath wooden awnings and crowded lanes. The smell strikes first. Fish laid over crushed ice, fresh bread, damp straw, cheese, wet wool, smoke from roasting meat, river mud carried in on boots. Human bodies pressed closely together, beneath layers of cloth and winter air. Oddly enough, after a few minutes, your senses begin accepting it all as normal. Human beings adapt remarkably quickly when necessary. A butcher wipes his hands against an apron, already carrying the history of several difficult mornings. Nearby, women sell onions and herbs from woven baskets, while children weave through the crowd, carrying messages or stolen apples, depending on personality and opportunity. The boat here feels physical. Near, nothing arrives invisibly. Every object must be carried, unloaded, cleaned, counted, negotiated, protected, repaired, cooked, or stacked by someone whose back probably hurts. You stop near a blacksmith's workshop, where sparks burst briefly into the dim afternoon air. Every time the hammer strikes glowing metal, heat rolls outward in waves carrying the sharp smell of charcoal and iron. Apprentices move carefully around the forge, with the nervous concentration of people fully aware that nearby mistakes can become memorable very quickly. The blacksmith himself barely pauses while speaking. Work must continue constantly, because nearly every part of city life depends on craftsmen like him. Nails, hinges, knives, tools, locks, horseshoes, cooking equipment, weapons, chains. Civilization, viewed closely enough, often resembles an endless struggle against broken objects. And behind much of this labor stood the guilds. Guilds organized many professions throughout medieval European cities. Bakers, blacksmiths, clothworkers, carpenters, and countless others formed tightly controlled associations, regulating training, standards, prices, competition, and membership. In theory, guilds protect quality and stability. In practice, some behaved rather like stubborn little business kingdoms, fiercely defending territory and privilege. Human beings have always been very creative when inventing complicated systems for arguing about money. You pass a guild hall where several older craftsmen debate regulations beside candles burning low against damp stone walls. Their robes smell faintly of rain and smoke. An apprentice waits nervously near the doorway, clutching sample work he hopes will satisfy his superiors enough to advance his position. Years of labor stand between him and independence. Training during the medieval period often began young and demanded extraordinary patience. Apprentices lived with masters, learned slowly through repetition, and absorbed not only technical skills, but also social rules governing trade itself. Success depends partly on talent, and partly on surviving other people's personalities long enough, which remains surprisingly modern. Farther south, the atmosphere changes again as you approach the Latin Quarter near the university. Here the streets fill with scholars, students, scribes, wandering tutors, priests, and young men possessing enormous confidence despite very uncertain financial situations. The University of Paris had become one of Europe's most important centers of learning by the Middle Ages. Theology, philosophy, law, and logic drew students from across the continent. Latin floated constantly through conversations, while debate spilled from classrooms into taverns, courtyards, and rented rooms crowded with books, candles, and sleep deprivation. A student named Luke leans dramatically over a wooden table inside a tavern while arguing about theology with three equally exhausted companions. Their cloaks are damp from rain. Their cups are mostly empty. One of them gestures so enthusiastically during an argument about Aristotle that he nearly knocked over a candle. Nobody seems moved. Medieval students developed reputations for noise, arrogance, debt, and occasional public disorder, severe enough that city authorities often complain about them. Some fight in the streets. Some disappeared into taverns for days. Some spent more time debating than bathing. Others, to be fair, truly changed intellectual history, became a teenager. Luke pauses mid-argument to admit quietly that he owes money to nearly everyone he knows. His friends nodded sympathetically before continuing the debate anyway, because scholarship, like many human activities, rarely waits for ideal financial conditions. Outside the tavern, rain begins again in thin drifting lines across the rooftops. Water runs through gutters, carrying scraps of straw and vegetable peels toward the river below. Bells ring for afternoon prayers, while nearby shopkeepers continue haggling with customers who pretend not to understand prices, despite repeating this performance almost daily. Paris feels wonderfully alive because it never entirely settles into order. Every district presses against another with different rhythms. Sacred spaces beside taverns, markets beside churches, scholars beside butchers, wealth beside desperate poverty. And somehow the city keeps operating through a mixture of habit, argument, labor, faith, and mutual inconvenience. You step briefly into a manuscript workshop, where scribes bend silently over parchment, illuminated by soft window light. The room smells of ink, wax, and scraped animal skin, carefully prepared for writing. One older scribe flexes cramped fingers before continuing another page. Books remain precious objects here, because copying them by hand requires astonishing amounts of time and concentration. Outside, however, a donkey immediately blocks traffic beside a fish cart, while two merchants begin shouting over whose fault it is. Civilization balances dignity and absurdity very closely together. As evening approaches, smoke thickens above rooftops, while taverns fill steadily with laborers escaping rain and fatigue. Luke and his companions continue arguing somewhere in the distance. The blacksmith still works, beside glowing iron. Market sellers pack unsold goods beneath heavy cloth before night dampness settles deeper into the city. And once darkness fully arrives, Paris will reveal another face entirely. One lit by torches, fog, alehouse windows, muddy alleys, and footsteps that sound very different after midnight. Historical focus: medieval crime, sanitation, taverns, night watchmen, urban survival after dark in Paris. Night settles slowly over Paris, though the city never becomes truly quiet. The markets shrink first. Wooden shutters close one by one. Merchants drag crates indoors, while apprentices cover goods remaining with rough cloth against the damp air drifting in from the river. Smoke thickens above the rooftops as evening fires burn brighter inside homes and taverns. Somewhere in the distance, bells mark the passing hour through low rolling fog. The streets grow stranger after dark. During daylight, medieval Paris feels crowded enough to overwhelm the senses completely. But nighttime changes the city into something narrower and more uncertain. Lantern light flickers weakly across wet stones. Alleyways deepen into shadow. Sounds carry farther. A cough from the next street over suddenly feels close enough to touch. You walk carefully now, underneath buildings, where upper floors hang over the road like tired shoulders. Rain Streets, earlier in the evening, has left the slick with mud, straw, spilled ale, and the accumulated realities of thousands of people living closely together without modern plumbing. Water runs sluggishly through gutters beside the road, carrying scraps, refuse, and things wiser travelers choose not to examine too carefully. The smell is impossible to ignore. Wood smoke, horse manure, wet wool, rotting vegetables, cheap wine, river dampness. Human bodies, too crowded together closely through long seasons of labor. And yet people still fall in love here, raise children here, laugh here, pray here, build, lives here. Human beings are remarkable adaptable creatures. Ahead, the torchlight sways gently through the fog as a night watchman rounds the corner carrying a wooden staff. His name is Etienne, and he has spent enough years walking these streets after dark that he can recognize neighborhoods by sound alone. A tavern district never sleeps the same way as a monastery quarter. Tonight, his boots splash softly through shallow puddles while he watches shadows moving behind rain-streaked windows. Laughter bursts suddenly from one alehouse before fading back into muffled conversation. Somewhere farther away, a baby cries through thin walls, while nearby a drunk man sings half a song and forgets the rest. Medieval cities possessed organized night watches in many periods, though effectiveness varied considerably depending on funding, local politics, weather, and whether the guards themselves had recently visited taverns. Some patrolled seriously. Others mostly hoped nothing complicated would happen before dawn. A surprising timeless approach to public administration. Etienne pauses beneath an archway, while two workers hurry past, carrying buckets toward the river. Night work often involves tasks nobody wanted to discuss during dinner: waste removal, cleaning, transporting unpleasant materials away from crowded neighborhoods before morning reopened. Cities survive, partly because somebody is always awake handling uncomfortable responsibilities quietly in the background. You follow the watchman toward a bridge crossing the Seine, where fog drifts low above dark water. Houses built directly atop the bridge lean outward over the current below. Their windows glow dimly through mist. Somewhere beneath the wooden supports, river water slaps steadily against rocks. A thin figure darts suddenly through the fog nearby. Etienne barely reacts, probably a thief, or a messenger, or a frightened apprentice avoiding trouble. Medieval Paris contains pickpockets, gamblers, smugglers, prostitutes, runaway servants, petty criminals, and desperate people trying very hard not to starve. Great cities gather opportunity and hardship together in equal measure. Crime was not constant chaos exactly, more like another layer woven into ordinary urban life. You pass an alley where several men crouch around dice games beside lantern light, reflecting weakly off wet walls. Coins clink softly between rough fingers. One player swears under his breath, while another laughs with the exhausted amusement of someone who has already lost too much money to care properly anymore. Nearby, a woman sells hot chestnuts from a smoking pan, despite the late hour, because nighttime crowds still need food. Steam curls upward around her face, while customers warm cold hands beside the heat. Even survival becomes a nighttime economy. Farther along, Etienne stops outside a narrow building, where voices rise sharply from within. For a moment, it sounds like a fight may begin. Then, someone bursts out laughing instead, and the tension dissolves into weary, drunken singing. Most nights, danger arrives less drastic than stories prefer. Not assassins lurking elegantly on rooftops. Usually arguments, hunger, alcohol, cold weather, illness, exhaustion, the slow pressure of too many people crowded too closely together. Inside a nearby tavern, the air feels thick enough to drink. Smoke hangs beneath the ceiling beams, while laborers, sailors, students, and merchants crowd shoulder to shoulder around rough wooden tables. Candlelight flickers across tired, flushed faces from wine and heat. Someone snores quietly near the hearth, despite the noise surrounding him. Luc, the university student from earlier, still debates philosophy at the far corner table, although now his arguments sound slower and less certain after several cups of ale. One companion has fallen asleep entirely, with his cheek pressed against folded arms, while another attempts to explain theology using a loaf of bread as visual demonstration. History's greatest intellectual breakthroughs occasionally occurred among people snoring into soup. Outside again, fog thickens toward midnight. The city narrows into isolated pockets of torchlight, floating inside darkness. Notre Dame rises above the rooftops in silhouette, immense and silent now, except for the occasional low bell rolling outward through the mist. Even the cathedral feels different after dark, less triumphant, more watchful. Etienne pauses briefly near the church square while rubbing warm back into stiff hands. Somewhere, nearby, hidden behind shuttered windows, families sleep packed closely together beneath blankets while rain taps softly against the city once more. Others remain awake beside sick relatives. Others pray quietly for work tomorrow. Others gamble away wages already insufficient before they were lost. Paris contains all of them at once, and despite the mud, the noise, the smoke, the theft, the overcrowding, and the endless struggle of medieval survival, the city continues to breathe steadily through the darkness, not orderly, but alive. By morning, bread ovens will glow again. Market carts will rattle back across the bridges. Bells will ring over rooftops silvered by rain. Students will resume arguments. Merchants will reopen shutters. Laborers will return to work before sunrise fully arrives. And somewhere beyond France, far south beneath warmer skies and candlelit palaces, another city prepares for its own kind of danger entirely. One built not from crowded streets and muddy survival, but from ambition sharp enough to draw kingdoms. Winter settles heavily over Paris. The river moves dark beneath low clouds, while cold wind slips through the streets, carrying smoke, damp wool, and the rich heavy smell of roasting meat from market fires burning late into the evening. Frost gathers along wooden shutters. Church bells roll slowly through the grey sky above the crowded city, deep enough to vibrate softly in your chest if you stand still long enough beneath them. And despite the cold, Paris grows louder tonight, because medieval cities, no matter how exhausting life became, still understood something important. Human beings cannot survive endlessly beneath pressure, without occasionally finding ways to laugh, feast, sing, argue, dance, or briefly pretend the world feels lighter than it is truly. For a few evenings each year, the city allows itself to breathe differently. You move now toward the crowded square near Notre Dame, where torchlight flickers against damp stone walls blackened by smoke and weather. Vendors line the streets selling hot wine, chestnuts, pastries, roasted birds, and thick stew, ladled into rough bowls that warm frozen hands almost immediately. Steam rises everywhere into the cold night air. Children weave through the crowd, chasing one another between cloaks and boots, while musicians play pipes badly enough that nobody entirely agrees whether the sound counts as music anymore. Fortunately, wine helps medieval people answer difficult philosophical questions like that. The great cathedral towers overhead, immense and solemn, even during celebration. Candlelight glows through colored glass while priests move through side entrances, wrapped tightly against the cold. Incense drifts outward whenever doors open briefly, mixing strangely with smoke from food stalls and muddy winter streets below. Sacred and ordinary life constantly overlapped here. That overlap shaped medieval Paris deeply. Religion was not confined to private belief or weekly ritual. Church bells organized time itself. Feast days structures the calendar. Saints watch from statues above crowded markets. Prayers rose beside tavern songs and arguments over bread prices. Even celebration often carries layers of devotion beneath it. Yet medieval festivals could also become wonderfully chaotic. The Feast of Fools, partly because of later descriptions both amused and horrified, allowed lower-ranking clergy and ordinary participants to temporarily parody authority and ceremony. Mock processes moved through the streets, roles reversed briefly. Laughter spilled into space is usually governed by strict hierarchy, not permanent religion. More like society loosening its collar for an evening before tightening it again by morning. You stand beneath drifting snow near the edge of the square, while masked performers pass, carrying candles through the darkness. Bells ring overhead. Somewhere nearby, a pig escapes briefly into the crowd and creates several moments of entirely preventable panic. A group of students immediately begins cheering, for reasons nobody fully understands. Paris at times like this feels almost dreamlike, not exactly peaceful, but alive in every direction at once. A woman named Margot moves through the crowd, carrying baskets of fresh bread balanced against her shoulders. Earlier this morning, she worried about rising grain prices and whether her younger brother's fever might worsen before spring. Tonight, she laughed openly for the first time in days, while listening to musicians outside a tavern, glowing gold through frosted windows. Exhaustion pauses briefly here, not because hardships disappear, but because people refuse to surrender every corner of joy to it. Farther along the street, Luke and several university companions stumble out from an overcrowded alehouse, still debating theology despite obvious evidence that none of them should currently be trusted with complex reasoning. One tries to sing a hymn properly. Another forgets half the words midway through and replaces them with confident nonsense instead. Oddly enough, the others continue singing anyway. History becomes much easier to survive emotionally once people stop insisting upon perfection constantly. Near the cathedral entrance, torchlight reflects softly across wet stone, while nobles wrapped in expensive fur-lined cloaks pass aside laborers with mud still dried onto their boots from daytime work. For a few hours, the boundaries separating social classes blur slightly beneath music, cold weather, crowded streets, and shared ritual. Not completely, of course. Medieval hierarchy remains very real. Hunger remains real. Illness remains real. Winter remains very real indeed. But festivals allowed temporary release from the endless discipline of ordinary survival. You enter a tavern now, where warmth strikes almost physically after the frozen streets outside. Smoke curls beneath low ceiling beams darkened by generations of firelight. Roasted meat turns slowly over open flames, while customers crowd shoulder to shoulder around rough tables slick with spilled ale. A tired carpenter sleeps sitting upright near the hearth, with bread still loosely clutched in one hand. Nearby, sailors argue over dice games, while a serving girl threads carefully through the chaos, carrying bowls heavy enough to leave bruises by morning. Someone begins dancing badly. Several more people immediately joined. The music grows louder. Laughter rises toward the ceiling beams, while outside the snow continues drifting softly across Paris beneath the bells of Notre Dame. And perhaps this is what keeps the city alive, despite everything else. Not cleanliness, certainly not efficient, but resilience expressed noisily. A willingness to keep gathering together beneath smoke, cold weather, political tension, overwork, muddy streets, and uncertain futures. To keep eating warm food beside strangers. To keep lighting candles against winter darkness. To keep singing even when half the words disappear. Much later, after midnight finally passes, the celebrations begin softening gradually into quieter exhaustion. The streets are empty, little by little beneath drifting fog. Vendors extinguish fires. Tavern doors close. Bells echo more slowly now, through frozen air above rooftops silvered faintly with snow. Margot returns home carrying unsold bread beneath her cloak. Luke finally falls asleep at a table inside the tavern, while one exhausted friend continues debating philosophy alone for several minutes before noticing. Somewhere inside Notre Dame, candles still flicker beside silent prayers offered for entirely different worries than those outside. Paris never truly slept completely. It breathes, shifted, murmured, argued, luxurious, endured. And far south of these crowded winter streets, beneath warmer skies and candlelit corridors filled with whispers, another man was preparing to force his will upon Italy, with enough ambition to frighten even the people closest to him. Rome smells different from Paris. Warmer, for one thing, even during the rain. The air drifting through the streets carries traces of olive oil, damp stone, horse sweat, incense, river water, and candle smoke, lingering beneath the high-painted ceilings of churches that seem almost too beautiful for ordinary human behavior, occurring beneath them. And yet ordinary human behavior thrives here magnificently. You arrive in Rome during the late 1500s, where cardinals glide through candlelit halls wrapped in crimson silk, while spies, merchants, diplomats, servants, priests, bankers, and ambitious noble families move constantly beneath the surface of public ceremonies. Like currents beneath dark water, the city appears wholly from a distance. Closer inspection reveals paperwork, politics, whisper rivalries, expensive dinners, nervous alliances, and enough quiet paranoia to keep entire candle industries financially successful for generations. Rain taps softly against Vatican windows tonight, while servants move through long corridors carrying sealed letters between private chambers. The floors shine faintly beneath the torchlight. Voices remain carefully controlled here. Nobody important truly shouts if whispering might accomplish the same damage more elegantly. You walk beside a young church official named Matteo, carrying stacks of copied correspondence through the apostolic palace. Ink stains mark his fingers permanently now, despite repeated washing. He knows better than to read the letters directly, although he occasionally notices names repeated, often enough to become impossible to ignore. Rival families, military contracts, French envoys, land disputes, marriage negotiations. Power in Renaissance Italy traveled through paper almost as often as swords, and somewhere nearby within this maze of velvet, incense, and guarded conversations walks Cesare Borgia. Popular history remembers him dramatically. Ruthless prince, political schemer, inspiration for Machiavelli's writings about power. Sometimes monsters, sometimes genius. Usually both depend on who survives long enough to write the history afterward. But tonight, before all of that fully unfolds, he is simply a young man trapped inside clothing he does not entirely want to wear. Cesare was born into the powerful Borgia family, the son of Rodrigo Borgia, the ambitious churchman who would later become Pope Alexander VI. Like many noble families of the Renaissance, the Borgias treated influence almost like a competitive sport, requiring constant strategy and alarming amounts of confidence. Children of elite families rarely enjoyed fully independent futures. Careers were often chosen politically long before adulthood arrived. Older sons inherited titles and military responsibilities. Younger sons entered the church. Daughters became valuable pieces within marriage alliances, carefully arranged to strengthen family influence. Human affection exists inside these systems, certainly, but ambition usually occupied more space at the table. Cesare entered church life young and rose quickly through powerful connections. By his late teens, he already held prestigious positions and eventually became a cardinal, while still very young by modern standards. The robes were magnificent, the authority is substantial, the future is secure, and yet many accounts suggest he never truly possesses comfort inside clerical life. You see him now, standing silently beside a tall window, while rain slides down the glass beyond Rome's rooftops. Candlelight flickers across embroidered sleeves, heavy with ceremonial detail. Nearby priests discuss theological matters softly, while servants refill wine cups and adjust dripping wax beneath silver holders. Cesare barely listens. His attention drifts repeatedly toward military reports arriving from northern Italy, border conflicts, mercenary movements, fortifications, political instability spreading across fractured city-states, constant balancing alliances delicate to the lapse. After a single bad decision, Renaissance Italy was wealthy, artistic, sophisticated, and deeply unstable all at once. Cities compete fiercely. Noble families kidnapped one another regularly. Foreign kingdoms collided constantly. Armies march. Alliances shifted. Popes ruled spiritually, while also behaving like political rulers, managing territory, diplomacy, and war. The Renaissance produced astonishing art, partly because powerful people were competing aggressively enough to decorate entire cities while attempting to outmaneuver one another politically. Human vanity occasionally leaves behind very beautiful ceilings. Matteo passes quietly through another corridor, where rumors drift almost visibly through the candle smoke. Several servants whisper that Cesare grows increasingly frustrated with ceremonial duties. Others claim he practices military strategy obsessively. One elderly cardinal dismisses him as reckless beneath his breath, before immediately checking whether anyone overheard. Carelessness is dangerous in Rome. In private chambers, Cesare studies maps spread across heavy wooden tables, while rainwater rattles softly against shutters outside. The room smells of parchment, damp wool cloaks, and cooling candle wax. A sword rests nearby almost casually, though nothing in this room feels truly casual. He wants movement, action, territory, influence beyond ritual. The church offers power, certainly, but a constrained kind requires patience, diplomacy, and public restraint. Cesare's temperament seems built for something sharper, faster, more directly, like a hunting dog forced to sit perfectly still during dinner. Outside, Rome continues glowing beneath rain-dark skies. Taverns remain crowded despite the weather. Pilgrims sleep beneath the monastery roofs. Merchants calculate profits by lantern light, while priests move silently through chapels scented with incense and old stone. And above them all, the Vatican hums quietly with ambition, disguised carefully as ceremony. Eventually, Rodrigo Borgia becomes Pope Alexander VI, one of the most controversial and politically ambitious popes in history. Suddenly, the Borgia family rises even higher within Rome's dangerous hierarchy. Wealth expands, influence deepens, enemies multiply. For Cesare, the transformation feels almost immediate. The careful boundaries surrounding his life begin loosening. Military possibilities emerge. Political opportunities widen, and beneath the velvet robes and polished church ritual, something restless finally senses movement ahead. Matteo notices it first in the corridors. The atmosphere changes, adjusting around powerful families when ambition accelerates. More messengers arrive after dark. More doors close during conversations. More guards appear beside stairways. More people lower their voices unexpectedly when following approach. Rome itself seems to inhale quietly, because once Cesare Borgia finally steps away from the life prepared for him since childhood, Italy will begin shifting around that decision like chess pieces, disturbed by a sudden hand across the board. And beyond the palace walls tonight, the rain continues, falling softly over the ancient city, while candle flames tremble gently aside. Windows overlooking a future nobody inside Rome fully understood yet. Rain follows Cesare Borgia almost everywhere now. Not dramatic storms crashing across battlefields, like paintings prefer, but cold persistent rain, soaking cloaks, darkening roads, dripping from castle walls, and turning military camps into landscapes of mud, wet canvas, and exhausted men, trying unsuccessfully to sleep beside smoking fires. Italy feels restless beneath him. You travel south through Romagna, where fortified towns rise above damp hills wrapped in morning mist. Soldiers move along muddy roads carrying pikes and crossbows, while messengers ride hard between cities already nervous about which alliance might collapse next. Church bells echo faintly across valleys, where vineyards disappear into grey weather. Nothing here feels stable for long. After leaving behind his church career, Cesare transformed himself rapidly into a military and political force, supported heavily by the authority of his father, Pope Alexander VI. He launched campaigns across central Italy, attempting to bring fragmented territories under tighter control. Some cities surrendered through negotiation. Others resisted behind thick walls, smelling of wet stone and fear. Renaissance politics often resembled arranged dinners where everyone suspected poison, but participated anyway, because the invitation carefully looked even more dangerous. You arrive at one such gathering now. Inside a fortified palace lit by rows of candles, trembling in damp air, nobles and military captains sit around long tables covered with wine, roasted meat, and uneasy politeness. Outside, rain taps steadily against shuttered windows, while armed guards linger quietly, hidden covered walkways. The conversation remains smooth, too smooth. Cesare watches carefully from beneath heavy candlelight, reflects faintly across dark velvet sleeves. Nearby, men laugh at jokes slightly too late. Cups rise and lower. Servants refill plates, while pretending not to notice the tension tightening gradually around the room. Everyone here understands something important. Power in Italy rarely stayed still. The famous incident at Senigallia later became one of the most discussed moments of Cesare's career. Rival commanders who believed themselves safely reconciled with him arrived under promises of peace and negotiation. Instead, Cesare moved decisively against them once they lowered their guard. Historians still debate details and motivations carefully. But what lingers emotional is not excitement. It is cold inevitability. The sense that trust had become so fragile in Renaissance politics that even shared meals could feel dangerous beneath enough candlelight. Far away in Florence, Niccolò Machiavelli observes much of this world closely while serving as a diplomat. He watches Cesare with intense fascination, seeing in him an example of political boldness capable of imposing temporary order upon chaos through calculation, recklessness, and carefully controlled fear. Later generations would remember Machiavelli almost like a prophet of ruthless politics. But tonight he is simply another tired official, traveling muddy roads between unstable powers while trying to survive complicated conversations. You continue moving with Cesare's forces through towns scarred by conflict and uncertainty. Soldiers repair damaged walls beneath steady drizzle. Horses stand steaming in cold air after long marches. Clerks copy treats by lantern light, while ink spreads slightly on damp parchment. Everything feels temporary, victories especially. A servant named Elena works inside a household near one of the occupied towns. Each evening she listens quietly, while officials discuss shifting alliances through nearby doorways, left slightly open during dinner. Names change constantly. Loyalties change constantly. Yesterday's ally becomes tomorrow's threat with exhausting speed. Ordinary people learn quickly not to become emotionally attached to political certainty. It rarely survives long enough. Yet despite the fear surrounding him, Cesare truly achieves remarkable military and administrative success for a time. Roads become safer in certain regions. Local disorder depression. Fragmented territories begin responding to centralized authority more consistently. His reputation grows rapidly across Italy and beyond. Some admire him deeply. Others sleep poorly because of him. Perhaps both reactions are signs of effective power. Still, beneath the victories, fragility waits patiently, because Cesare's position depends enormously upon his father's survival. Pope Alexander VI protects the Borgia network politically, financially, and diplomatically. As long as the Pope remains powerful, enemies hesitate carefully. The illness arrived. History changes direction surprisingly often because human bodies fail at inconvenient moments. In the summer of the year 1503, both Cesare and his father became seriously sick. Rumors spread wildly through Rome. Poison, malaria, corruption punished by divine judgment. Nobody knows exactly what to believe because Renaissance Italy produces rumors almost as efficiently as it produces churches. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere thickens with dread. Matteo moves silently through corridors, now crowded with anxious servants and exhausted physicians carrying bowls of water, cloth, herbs, and candles, burning day and night beside fever rooms, smelling faintly of sweat, incense, and sickness. Whispered prayers drift beneath painted ceilings, while outside the city continues, breathing nervously through heavy summer heat. Then Pope Alexander dies. Not during glorious ceremony, not at the height of triumphant conquest. Simply as a sick old man surrounded by frightened attendants inside dim rooms, where candle wax melts, slowly through sleepless nights. And suddenly the structure holding Cesare's power together begins cracking almost immediately. Enemies return. Allies hesitate. Rivals maneuver. New church leadership emerges hostile toward Borgia influence. The future narrows fearfully fast. Elena hears church bells spreading the news across the city, while servants around her fall silent one by one. Outside, rain begins again over Rome, as though the weather itself has grown tired. Cesare survives the illness physically, but politically the damage deepens. Territories slip away. Support weakens. Former allies reposition themselves carefully beneath changing conditions. The man who once seemed capable of reshaping Italy now struggles simply to preserve fragments of influence. Power collapses faster than people expect, because it often depends on invisible structures nobody notices until they disappear. By the final years of his life, Cesare drifted far from the heights of his earlier ambition. Battles continued. Exile follows. The grand dream of permanent control fades gradually into smaller struggles against time, enemies, illness, and memory itself. You stand now beside a rain-dark window, while distant bells roll softly across Rome once more. Somewhere beyond the city walls, soldiers still march through mud beneath banners, already beginning to fade. Inside the Vatican, clerks continue copying documents, because governments survive partly through paperwork continuing regardless of personal tragedy. And perhaps that is the quiet sadness beneath so many powerful historical figures. For a brief moment, they seem enormous enough to reshape entire worlds. Then fever entered the room, and the candles keep burning without them. The sea arrived first. Long before you see the city itself, you hear water striking wooden hulls beneath grey morning skies, while cold wind moves across the deck, carrying salt, tar, wet rope fish, and the faint smoke of distant shore fires somewhere beyond the horizon. Gulls wheel overhead cries sharply through the mist, while waves slap steadily against the sides of the ship, in rhythms almost gentle enough to sleep beside. You stand among northern men, traveling farther from home than most of their ancestors could have imagined. Some come from Norway, others from Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, or settlements stretching along the rivers of Eastern Europe. Many have crossed terrifying distances through storm water, forests, frozen rivers, unfamiliar kingdoms, and dangerous trade routes where survival depends partly upon strength and partly upon luck remaining awake slightly longer than disaster. And ahead of them waits Constantinople. Even the name feels enormous. To travelers from the cold north, the Byzantine capital must have seemed almost unreal when seen for the first time. A city of towering walls, crowded harbors, golden domes, enormous churches, marble palaces, markets overflowing with spices and silk, and more people than some villages back home might see across generations combined. Halfdan sees it at sunrise. He grips the side of the ship silently, while pale light spreads across the Bosporus, and the city rises gradually through the morning fog ahead. Church domes caught the first dawn, glowing faintly gold above dark water, crowded with vessels from every direction imaginable. Bells echo across the harbor, while incense smoke drifts upward from unseen chapels, hidden somewhere within the immense stone labyrinth beyond the walls. Nothing in his life prepared him for this scale. Back home, winter winds move through pine forests and turf-roofed halls, smelling of smoke and damp wool. Here, sunlight flashes against mosaics and polished marble, while traders shout in languages he cannot understand beside docks, crowded with camels, monks, soldiers, silk merchants, fishermen, priests, and imperial officers, dressed richly enough to resemble walking treasure chests. The world suddenly feels much larger than the sagas promised. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Norse warriors had already developed reputations across Europe and beyond for military skill, endurance, and terrifying determination in battle. Some arrived as raiders, others as traders, mercenaries, settlers, or professional soldiers willing to serve foreign rulers in exchange for wealth and opportunity. The Byzantine emperors recognized something useful in these outsiders. Foreign warriors possess one enormous political advantage. They belong to nobody local. Court politics inside Constantinople could become dangerously complicated. Noble families compete constantly for influence. Generals plotted. Officials maneuvered carefully through layers of intrigue, thick enough to suffocate trust entirely. In such an environment, bodyguards recruited from distant northern cultures often seem more reliable, precisely because they rely on deep connections to Byzantine rivalries. Loyalty becomes simpler when your entire future depends upon the emperor paying you regularly. And so the Varangian Guard emerge. Elite foreign soldiers serving as imperial protectors, palace guards, battlefield troops, and symbols of fierce loyalty surrounding the Byzantine throne. Halfdan followed the others through crowded harbor streets, where every sensory detail felt overwhelming. Spice smoke curls through warm air, unlike the colder northern winds he understands instinctively. Market stalls overflow with oranges, figs, wine, oil, bronze lamps, embroidered cloth, and carved icons shimmering beneath sunlight. Somewhere nearby, musicians play instruments' rhythms sound strangely fluid compared to the heaviest songs of northern halls. Even the food tastes unfamiliar. History often describes military service through battles and politics, but soldiers also experience empires through stomach confusion. Inside the imperial district, marble floors reflect candlelight beneath ceilings, covered with mosaics glowing gold against deep blue backgrounds. Incense hangs constantly in the air, besides the smell of hot wax and polished metal. The guards' axes and armor appear severely against all this luxury, like pieces of northern winter carried accidentally into a jeweled dream. The contrast becomes part of their identity. Norse traditions mixed gradually with Byzantine ceremony until the Varangians developed a culture both foreign and deeply tied to the empire they served. They guarded emperors during rituals, marched through palace corridors, fought in campaigns across distant territories, stood watch beside rulers who trusted them, partly because they remained outsiders even after years within the imperial world. Halfdan spends his first evening inside Constantinople, unable to sleep properly. From the barracks window, he watches lanterns moving along distant streets while the sea wind carries faint music through the darkness. Somewhere nearby, another Varangian laughed loudly enough to startle resting horses below. Homesickness arrives strangely, not all at once. Sometimes through smells, sometimes through weather, sometimes through realizing nobody nearby remembers the same stories you grew up hearing beside winter fires. An older guardsman named Ivar notices Halfdan staring outward toward the harbor and sitting beside him quietly. His beard has already begun graying at the edges, after spent decades far from Scandinavia. He spoke softly about snowfields back home, frozen rivers beneath moonlight, and the sound of axes striking pine wood during winter preparations. Then he gestures toward the city beyond the walls. "This place changes you," he says eventually. "Perhaps all empires do." The Varangians became legendary, partly because Byzantine chroniclers admired their battlefield discipline and fierce loyalty. They fought with heavy axes, capable of terrifying enemy troops during close combat. Yet what stands out most tonight is not violence. It is a wide view. The strange emotional experience of building a life far from familiar, serving rulers, whose language, religion, customs, and architecture would once have seemed impossibly foreign. Outside the barracks, waves strike softly against harbor walls, while incense smoke continues drifting upward into warm Mediterranean night air. Bells echo faintly across the sleeping city. Somewhere deep inside the palace complex, imperial officials still whisper through candlelit corridors about taxes, diplomacy, and war. Empires never sleep entirely either. And in the years ahead, these northern guardsmen will stand between Byzantine rulers and countless dangers, gathering slowly beyond the horizon like storms over dark water. The sea arrived first. Long before you see the city itself, you hear water striking wooden hulls beneath grey morning skies while cold wind moves across the deck carrying salt, tar, wet rope, fish, and the faint smoke of distant shore fires somewhere beyond the horizon. Gulls wheel overhead, cries sharply through the mist, while waves slap steadily against the sides of the ship in rhythms almost gentle enough to sleep beside. You stand among northern men traveling farther from home than most of their ancestors could have imagined. Some come from Norway, others from Denmark, Sweden, Iceland, or settlements stretching along the rivers of Eastern Europe. Many have crossed terrifying distances through stormwater, forests, frozen rivers, unfamiliar kingdoms, and dangerous trade routes, where survival depends partly upon strength and partly upon luck, remaining awake slightly longer than disaster. And ahead of them waits Constantinople. Even the name feels enormous. To travelers from the cold north, the Byzantine capital must have seemed almost unreal when seen for the first time. A city of towering walls, crowded harbors, golden domes, enormous churches, marble palaces, markets overflowing with spices and silk, and more people than some villages back home might see across generations combined. Halfdan sees it at sunrise. He grips the side of the ship silently, while pale light spreads across the Bosporus, and the city rises gradually through the morning fog ahead. Church domes caught the first dawn, glowing faintly gold above dark water, crowded with vessels from every direction imaginable. Bells echo across the harbor, while incense smoke drifts upward from unseen chapels hidden somewhere within the immense stone labyrinth beyond the walls. Nothing in his life prepared him for this scale. Back home, winter winds moved through pine forests and turf-roofed halls smelling of smoke and damp wool. Here, sunlight flashes against mosaics and polished marble, while traders shout in languages he cannot understand inside docks crowded with camels, monks, soldiers, silk merchants, fishermen, priests, and imperial officers dressed richly enough to resemble walking treasure chests. The world suddenly feels much larger than the sagas promised. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Norse warriors had already developed reputations across Europe and beyond for military skill, endurance, and terrifying determination in battle. Some arrived as raiders, others as traders mercenaries, settlers, or professional soldiers, willing to serve foreign rulers in exchange for wealth and opportunity. The Byzantine emperors recognized something useful in these outsiders. Foreign warriors possess one enormous political advantage. They belong to nobody local. Court politics inside Constantinople could become dangerously complicated. Noble families compete constantly for influence. Generals plotted. Officials maneuvered carefully through layers of intrigue, thick enough to suffocate trust entirely. In such an environment, bodyguards, recruited from distant northern cultures, often seem more reliable, precisely because they rely on deep connections to Byzantine rivalries. Loyalty becomes simpler when your entire future depends upon the emperor paying you regularly. And so the Varangian Guard emerge. Elite foreign soldiers serving as imperial protectors, palace guards, battlefield troops, and symbols of fierce loyalty surrounding the Byzantine throne. Halfdan followed the others through crowded harbor streets where every sensory detail felt overwhelming. Spice smoke curls through warm air, unlike the colder northern winds. He understands instinctively. Market stalls overflow with oranges, figs, wine, oil, bronze lamps, embroidered cloth, and carved icons shimmering beneath sunlight. Somewhere nearby, musicians play instruments' rhythms sound strangely fluid compared to the heaviest songs of northern halls. Even the food tastes unfamiliar. History often describes military service through battles and politics, but soldiers also experience empires through stomach confusion. Inside the imperial district, marble floors reflect candlelight beneath ceilings covered with mosaics glowing gold against deep blue backgrounds. Incense hangs constantly in the air, besides the smell of hot wax and polished metal. The guards' axes and armor appear severely against all this luxury, like pieces of northern winter carried accidentally into a jeweled dream. The contrast becomes part of their identity. Norse traditions mix gradually with Byzantine ceremony until the Varangians developed a culture both foreign and deeply tied to the empire they served. They guarded emperors during rituals, marched through palace corridors, fought in campaigns across distant territories, stood watch beside rulers who trusted them partly because they remained outsiders even after years within the imperial world. Halfdan spends his first evening inside Constantinople, unable to sleep properly. From the barracks window, he watches lanterns moving along distant streets, while the sea wind carries faint music through the darkness. Somewhere nearby, another Varangian laughed loudly enough to startle resting horses below. Homesickness arrives strangely, not all at once, sometimes through smells, sometimes through weather, sometimes through realizing nobody nearby remembers the same stories you grew up hearing, beside winter fires. An older guardsman named Ivar notices Halfdan staring outward toward the harbor and sitting beside him quietly. His beard has already begun graying at the edges after spent decades far from Scandinavia. He spoke softly about snowfields back home, frozen rivers beneath moonlight, and the sound of axes striking pine wood during winter preparations. Then he gestures toward the city beyond the walls. "This place changes you," he says eventually. "Perhaps all empires do." The Varangians became legendary, partly because Byzantine chroniclers admired their battlefield discipline and fierce loyalty. They fought with heavy axes capable of terrifying enemy troops during close combat. Yet what stands out most tonight is not violence. It is a wide view, the strange emotional experience of building a life far from familiar landscapes while serving rulers whose language, religion, customs, and architecture would once have seemed impossibly foreign. Outside the barracks, waves strike softly against harbor walls, while incense smoke continues drifting upward into warm Mediterranean night air. Bells echo faintly across the sleeping city. Somewhere deep inside the palace complex, imperial officials still whisper through candlelit corridors about taxes, diplomacy, and war. Empires never sleep entirely either. And in the years ahead, these northern guardsmen will stand between Byzantine rulers and countless dangers, gathering slowly beyond the horizon, like storms over dark water. The night grows quieter now, not completely silent. History never truly becomes silent. Somewhere, even now, waves still strike old harbor walls beneath darkness. Rain still taps softly against temple roofs. Bells still drift through cold air above sleeping cities. Candle flames still tremble gently beside tired hands, trying to finish one more letter before rest finally arrives. But the noise has softened enough for reflection. You have wandered through many worlds tonight, through wet Japanese roads where exhausted samurai worried about taxes beneath elegant armor, through candlelit tea houses where beauty survived, because people worked endlessly to preserve it, through muddy military camps where Ashigaru soldiers repaired broken sandals before marching again at dawn, through where villages hidden rice beneath floorboards mattered more than glory ever could. You crossed crowded Parisian streets smelling of bread, smoke, river water, and survival itself. You heard students arguing philosophy inside overheated taverns, while bakers labored before sunrise, and night watchmen walked fog-covered alleys beneath cathedral bells. You watched tired people laugh during winter festivals, because human beings sometimes need joy almost as desperately as food. Then came Rome. Velvet corridors glowing beneath candlelight, whispered ambition drifting through palace walls, clerks carrying sealed letters through sleepless nights, while powerful families rose and collapsed beneath the fragile health of aging men. You watched Cesare Borgia reach toward permanence inside a world where fever could quietly undo years of strategy within days. And finally, you stood beside northern guardsmen, staring out across dark Byzantine waters, far from the homes they still carried inside memory. You touched worn runes carved into ancient marble by hands long disappeared from the earth, except for those small marks remaining quietly behind. All of it feels distant now, and strangely close at the same time. Perhaps that is what history really becomes after enough centuries pass. Not lists of kings and battles alone, but echoes of ordinary sensations survive beneath larger myths. Wet shoes drying beside fires, steam rising from soup during winter evenings, the ache of tired shoulders after long work, the relief of hearing familiar voices in foreign places. Human beings rarely change as completely as they imagine they have. Outside, the rain moves softly through the darkness again. Somewhere far away in memory, Taro's wife folds repaired clothing beside dim lantern light, while counting rice carefully enough to survive another season. Aiko graceful conversation, despite exhaustion settling into her knees after hours of kneeling. Genjiro removes mud from his spear while listening to distant thunder beyond military camps, smelling of smoke and wet earth. In Paris, Margot carries warm bread through freezing streets before dawn while Luke falls halfway through another argument he was absolutely certain he would win. Etienne the watchman walks slowly beneath torchlight, reflects off rain-dark stones, while tavern songs drift weakly through the fog. And in Rome, Matteo still copies letters beneath flickering candlelight, while somewhere down the hallway, another ambitious man whispers carefully about the future, as though history might finally agree to behave predictably this time. It never does, of course. Far beyond them all, Ivar rests beside the sea, after long years of service beneath Byzantine gold. The harbor wind carries salt and distant incense through the night while old memories of northern forests return softly between waking and sleep. These people never consider themselves myths. That happened later. While living, they are mostly worried about weather, illness, food, debt, loyalty, aging parents, aching backs, unsure futures, and whether tomorrow's work will become easier or harder. Usually harder. History can be impressively consistent about that. And yet beauty survived anyway, not because the world was peaceful, not because people were wiser in the past, but because ordinary human beings kept making beautiful things inside difficult lives. Tea bowls repaired with gold, cathedrals raised stone by stone, songs shared beside tavern fires, poems written during storms, gardens planted beside war-torn roads, small moments of gentleness preserved stubbornly against uncertainty. Perhaps that is why these old worlds still linger so strongly in the imagination, not because they were perfect, but because they were fragile. The samurai polishing armor by candlelight knew that peace could fail. Parisian bakers knew winter could become cruel quickly. Renaissance rulers knew alliances dissolved like smoke. Varangian guardsmen knew empires eventually weakened no matter how brightly marble halls shine beneath golden ceilings. Impermanence surrounds them constantly, and maybe that awareness sharpened their appreciation for brief moments of warmth, ritual, companionship, and beauty. You can almost hear those moments now, as the night deepens further around you. Rainwater slipping from roof tiles into dark canals, bells echoing through cold air before fading completely. Firewood settles softly into embers. Footsteps crossing distant corridors where candles burn low against stone walls. Quiet laughter from another room. The turning of pages. The sigh of tired people finally resting after long days' systems beneath far larger than themselves. History survives partly through monuments and records, but emotional, it survives through textures. Smoke, rain, bread, ink, mud, velvet, salt air, candle wax, wet woods. The ordinary physical details that once surrounded people who never expected strangers centuries later to imagine them softly before sleep. And so, the myths loosen a little by the end of the journey. The perfect samurai becomes a weary administrator with sore shoulders. The mighty city becomes crowded people trying to stay warm. The feared ruler becomes a restless man vulnerable to fever. The legendary guardsman becomes someone quietly missing home beneath foreign stars. The distance between past and present grows smaller then, almost gentle, because beneath the armor, crowns, robes, walls, banners, and legends, you eventually find the same fragile human shape waiting every time. People trying to endure uncertainty with dignity. People try to create meaning before the candles burn out. People hoping, in small, quiet ways, to be reminded kindly. And so we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, rain-dark streets, and the small, brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watching.